evening, everyone, and welcome to episode 100 of the Retrospectives podcast, Pathologic 2. My name is Patrick Arthur, and I'm joined, as always, by my co-host, James Turlings. James, it's been a long time in the making, but we finally hit episode 100, and what better way to celebrate it than with Pathologic 2? I'm very excited for this one.
I don't know of a more miserable way to celebrate something, but I was very excited also for this one. The first game, of course, was one that we had mixed opinions on, but both of us agreed that the story and writing were fantastic, and I was very excited to hopefully play a game that also had fantastic gameplay.
Yeah, we should probably spend some time explaining why we are doing Pathologic 2 for episode 100. So, for those who are not familiar with us, who are listening to us for the first time, welcome. James and I are the Retrospectives podcast, and what we normally do is we play classic games of the past and we critically analyze and review them from a modern perspective. And the idea behind this is not only to weed out nostalgia and figure out which games have not stood the test of time, but in many ways, far more importantly, to identify when games have stood the test of time, in many cases because they use design principles that are rough around the edges. An example of this would be Thief. Thief is a game that has a map system where you're given a map that's kind of like, a lot of the time, a crudely handwritten map with not a lot of detail. And you have to use your imagination and your ability to piece together what's on the map and connect it to the 3D environment. You compare this to how a lot of modern games do map design, where everything is visible and your map is absolutely filled to the brim with markers. And it's clear to see that although we have changed the way that we do maps to this new spewy map design where all the information is visible to you, that's not necessarily a better system, and in many ways is a worse system, particularly for the kind of game that Thief strives to be. So a lot of what we're doing on this show is trying to identify when classic game design principles, either from a sense of ignorance or just because they knew what they were doing with a sense of restraint back in the day, have seized upon something special that has been forgotten, in particular by AAA game design. So how does this tie into Pathologic 2, our decision to do a game released in 2016, which absolutely breaks our 15 to 20-year-old rule in half? Well, Pathologic 2 is in many ways a combination of incredibly hostile mechanics to the player in a whole bunch of different ways that we'll get into shortly. And even its story is hostile to a player in a way that modern games aren't. And I think that it's a good example of a game that exemplifies this principle. So while Pathologic 2 isn't a classic old game by any stretch, it certainly has expanded on and refined a lot of the principles underlying many of the classic games that we've played in the past. Does that sound about right to you, James?
Yeah, probably. Honestly, my reasoning for playing it was that the first game was great, and I wanted to play the second one.
And that's a good reason as well. And you know, we've done games like that in the past. Although this one was a bit different because we've never actually played Pathologic 2. We'd played Dark Souls and we'd played Celeste, and we knew we'd love them. This one we only strongly suspected we would love, and I guess we'll find the truth of that as the episode goes on.
Absolutely.
So Pathologic 2, I think for this one, as is often true of sequel episodes that we do, we strongly recommend that you listen to our Pathologic 1 episode before listening to this one. I know this is episode 100 and it's very exciting, but Pathologic 2 isn't just a sequel to Pathologic 1, it's a remake, it's a reimagining. And in fact, many of the story beats from the first game are exactly the same in some ways as they are in Pathologic 2. It is a meaningfully different experience, so Pathologic 2 is a game that can stand alone, but a lot of our discourse this episode will be around Pathologic 1 versus Pathologic 2 because they both are so similar in so many ways. So straight up, highly recommend you listen to the Pathologic 1 episode first.
And there's a lot of discussion we probably won't be having a second time, just so we can, keep things fresh. So there's a reason to listen to both. So we probably are going to just skip past a few really important things that we discussed in detail back then. Although we'll definitely be visiting a few old chestnuts, I think.
Yeah, on that note, James, I think it's also worth talking about how if our feelings on Pathologic 1 have changed over time since we did that episode, because I know that we've talked before about how games can kind of stew on your brain and you can develop a deeper appreciation of them over time. Is that how you feel about Pathologic 1?
I already really liked the game and the world like on my first playthrough, despite some of the kind of monotonous aspects of the gameplay, which but having played Pathologic 2, I think there was something that I underappreciated about the monotony almost. Is a game with very eccentric philosophical characters who speak in allegory and mysticism half the time, and I think that the first game had a lot of dead time for you just to sit there with your thoughts, which now, having played the second game, I really appreciate. I think this is a much more involved experience, which overall I think is for the better. But there was, not a lot of time for me to process things as they happened compared to the first game. That said, I'm still really fond of the original. I'd say it's in my top 3 game stories ever. I really loved the world. It was a really special experience for me that I really don't think you can get anywhere else.
I think you've absolutely nailed it, James. And I think in many ways this is a good example of what we do on the show, which is that sometimes you don't appreciate the cost of adding things until you add them. So obviously Pathologic 2 has a much deeper, complex gameplay system than Pathologic 1, but that doesn't mean that Pathologic 1's absence of gameplay or more limited gameplay is entirely without merit. And so I have grown a deeper appreciation for Pathologic 1 over the past 2 weeks as I've struggled through Pathologic 2. I think that where we're going to start is story. So I'm not going to spend ages on this, but it is important to note what Pathologic 2 is exactly. So Pathologic 1 is a combination of 3 narratives: the Bachelor, the Haruspex, and the Changeling. These stories play out simultaneously over 12 days. So when you're playing as the Bachelor over your 12 days, the Haruspex and Changeling are also kind of doing their own thing, interacting with you, trying to heal people in their own way as you go about your business. And then the same thing happens as you play the other 2 characters. Pathologic 2, on the other hand, only has a single playable character, the Haruspex. There is some short DLC involving the Bachelor, which I think is the first 1 to 3 days. I haven't played it yet, but it's certainly something I'm interested in exploring. But what that means is that this is a far more restricted experience compared to the first game. So straight out the bat, from a narrative point of view, we're only playing 1 character really. So the other 2 characters are yet to be released. With the Bachelor playthrough, it seems, is in full development and is going to come out in DLC at some point. When we played Pathologic 1, James played as the Bachelor and I played as the Haruspex. I since went back and played most of the Bachelor playthrough and watched some videos, so I'm mostly familiar with what the Bachelor does in the original game. Are you super familiar with the Haruspex playthrough in the first game, James?
No, I wasn't actually, because I knew that we would be playing this game at some point, and I thought I would rather just experience it fresh, so I did my best to avoid spoilers for that route, other than what you shared with me on our first recording. So this is basically a brand new experience for me in some ways, and I'm kind of glad that I kept it that way.
Yeah, I'm actually kind of envious of you that you get to have both character playthroughs. However, the more I played, the more I realized that these playthroughs and the story in particular is actually quite different, even though it's ostensibly the same character.
Yes.
So the nature of Pathologic 2, I said it's kind of a remake, kind of a retelling, because the game story is effectively the same. You receive a letter from your father as the Haruspex, saying that he is in deadly danger. So you, Artemi Barak, a surgeon who was originally living in this town, you come back to save your father or just see what's going on. And before too long, a deadly epidemic breaks out, trapping you in the town, along with a cast of characters that are all struggling to survive, scheme, or betray one another. It's a real cesspool of corruption and messy politicking in the heart of a plague. And as one of the only 3 or 4 doctors in this place, it's up to you to try and develop some kind of cure or some kind of solution to this deadly, terrible plague that's ruining the town. That's all I'm going to say right now, but we will be getting into the weeds very shortly. This is going to be a fully spoiled episode, so we're not going to hold anything back. If you do want to experience this game's plot completely fresh, I highly encourage you to either play the games or watch a YouTube video if you're not up for this kind of gameplay. Either is fine. The story is fascinating enough in and of itself that watching people talk about it or explain it is going to be just as meaningful as experience. Well, not just as meaningful. It's going to be...
I disagree.
It's still going to be very enjoyable, even if it's not meaningful in exactly the same manner. So encourage you to do that first, or you can just listen to us talk about it, but we will not be holding back spoilers in any way, shape, or form. So, James, let's get into this. So, I wanted to start with you because you're coming into this from a very different perspective to me. I played the Haruspex playthrough in Pathologic 1, and I played it again this time, and at least to start with, the story was very, very, very close, and in terms of its plot beats over the first couple of days. My first question for you is, what did you think of this change in character, and what did you think of the change in style that the story being told? The Bachelor playthrough in Pathologic 1 is very much about politicking in a lot of ways. The Bachelor is a central figure in the game and is interacting with all the leaders and trying to solve the problem that's being faced the town in an almost administrative way. Because the Haruspex seems to have more of a personal journey, I guess. Did you find this change was for the better? Did you think it was different? Tell me how you felt about the Haruspex's story in a broad strokes fashion.
So, from my understanding was with the original game was that The Bachelor was meant to be the introductory route to the story. You're a character from the big city who doesn't know anything about the town on the Gorkin River. And you really, the townsfolk are very strange, very superstitious. There's all sorts of, oddities and quirks with their behavior.
What
the
they
town...
look like.
What they look like. There are these weird, seemingly not monsters, but not human beings that inhabit the town. All sorts of just weirdness.
The architecture.
The architecture is bizarre. The layout of the town makes no sense. The way people talk is very odd. They kind of explain to you that during this part of the year, September, the Twern fields are in full bloom, which casts this mind-addling miasma through the town.
So everyone's high.
Everyone's high as fuck all the time. The characters speak really allegorically, weird hushed tones, and sometimes they talk straight past you or ignore what you say. It's very strange, and as The Bachelor, this all was part and parcel of the experience. I wasn't expecting to understand things right away. And I was actually quite surprised at how little the Haruspex seems to understand as well. I get that, because he was born here, right? But he leaves as a child to go study medicine in the city. And a lot of the old ways have kind of left his memory. The game does this cool thing in dialogue where it lets you either roleplay as someone who has no idea what they're talking about, or lets you ask for people to jog your memory. And oftentimes this dialogue, the question is the answer itself, so you don't actually need to, click on it to get the explanation, which I thought was cool. But yeah, I felt like the Haruspex was just as lost as The Bachelor was initially on the first few days.
Yeah, and I have to say, definitely when I played as the Haruspex in Pathologic 1, I was completely lost because I hadn't played The Bachelor. I really went in with no idea what was happening and no idea of the machinations of everything that was going on around me. I guess I wanted to know, it's the Bachelor seems to be much more in contact with the heads of the city in his playthrough in number one, and he seems to be much more in charge of trying to
Yes.
organize a administrative solution to the plague. Did you feel as a Haruspex that he was just kind of bumbling around doing nothing, or do you think that he had an important role to play in the story compared to the Bachelor?
See, it's fascinating because here's a bit where I think the difference between the games comes into play. Because I actually think that the first game is a lot more linear in some ways than Pathologic 2, where Pathologic 1, basically every day you would be given these 3 quests and you would have to complete all 3. You're kind of free to pick and choose, to an extent what you do in this game. So there's a lot more, in some ways, there's a lot more agency here, which does lead to a feeling of you just struggling to work out what to do. But I think the game nudges you in the right directions enough that you kind of like, you have an idea, you know what you want to achieve, and trying to figure out how to achieve that is the main goal of the game. Whereas I think the Bachelor is very organized in his thought processes and the way that he interacts with the town folks. He goes through the proper channels, where the Haruspex, deals with some pretty shady figures, does some pretty shady stuff on his own, and gets tangled up in the deep end of the town's mysticism and the kin, who I basically had no prior experience with the Bachelor's route, and I learned a lot more about these characters and about their customs and history going through, and I think I got a lot more of a balanced view of the ending, because one of my favorite things about the original was that the ending is very subjective based on which character you played. Like, they all arrive at their own conclusions about the nature of the plague and the town. And in some ways, each of their conclusions is completely different and completely valid without invalidating the view of the other healers.
Yeah, and I completely felt that way, and I think that came through in our discussions in the episode we did on Pathologic, where you were telling me, like, it's obvious you have to preserve the polyhedron. I'm like, it's obvious you need to destroy it. And that was just because we were so in the headspace of the characters we were playing.
Yes.
So I have an opinion about this story from a broad perspective now that I've played both the Haruspex in game 1 and 2. And that is that I think the story is considerably worse in this game than it is in the original game, even if we narrow it down just to Haruspex's perspective.
Okay.
In the original game, the Haruspex, while he is more involved with the kin, and all of that is true, he is far more involved in the, I guess, in being given instructions and working together with this administrative structure that's ruling the city. You are constantly working with the Bachelor over multiple days to try to develop your first crack at the panacea. You're getting instruction from the Olegimsky family, both Vlad and his son. You're going to see the girl at the termitory. You're interacting with these administrative figures, and while you're not organizing it in the same way that the Bachelor is, you're viewed as an important figure, and you're being used as a tool by all of these different people, and they are all manipulating you. And one of the things that I love about the original playthrough, because I hadn't played as the Bachelor, it wasn't exactly clear to me the degree to which I was being manipulated. That's something that only grew as I played through the game and started experiencing it on a deeper and deeper level. In this game, I feel like the story has lost a lot of the subtle political machinations that kind of inhabited the world of Pathologic in a far denser way in the original game. You're just not interacting with these figures as much, and it just feels like you're kind of doing... I think the nature of this story, because it's kind of flatter and giving you more options to go in different directions, there's less emphasis placed on that main story thread, that complicated and cohesive main story thread that occupied the earlier game. I really just didn't connect to the writing as much in this game. And I think that it's because the world has shrunk around this one character, as opposed to the first game where it feels like all three stories were written at the same time and all together combined to make a more cohesive world. Does that ring true for you as well, James?
Yeah, I think it's because in order to, I'm going to say fix, in quotation marks, the gameplay, they've tried to make it less linear. And as a result, they kind of can't tell these like dense narrative plots in the same way that the first game could. Like, I think the three quests of the day in the first game kind of acted as this very, most of the plot of the game is contained therein. Whereas it's all kind of spread around now, and the game's developers kind of can't guarantee what exactly you're going to experience in the game. So to me, it felt a bit like you kind of did whatever for most of the game, and then at the very end, there was a couple of mandatory story segments that kind of tied things together. I completely understand that sacrifice had to be made with the story in order to improve the gameplay. So, like, I agree with what you're saying. Basically, it's difficult for me to know. Well, it's difficult for me to know how I would have reacted to this game had I played Pathologic 2 first, basically, because to me the world is not fresh anymore as it was when we played the first game. So I think a lot of the narrative doesn't hit as hard because I'm experiencing it for the second time, basically. And I find it difficult to tell where those feelings begin and end, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, no, and that's true for me as well. I was also feeling the same way. I'm like, have I lost a sense of wonder because I've played through the game first? But I don't think that's it. The other thing that stood out for me, and this is going to kind of go into dialogue, and we can go into that in more future, is that
I think that's worse.
Well, it's not just the specifics of the dialogue. I found that a lot of the interactions with specific characters was them being rude and uninterested and authoritative, like ordering me what to do. Or I'd go to a place and they'd be like, we're not talking to you, we're having our own conversation.
Yeah.
And you compare that to the first game where everyone is buttering you up. And this is the thing that was so good about Pathologic 1. People were manipulating you. They were trying to be kind to you. And if you played your cards right, you could manipulate them back by playing into their games in one way and doing something different. In this, it feels... I talked a lot in the previous episode about how Pathologic 1 was hostile to the player. And I don't mean hostile to the player in the sense that characters tell you to fuck off. I mean hostile to the player in the sense that these people are playing you. That these people are taking advantage of you and using you as a tool. And I just didn't really get the same feeling from this story. I got the feeling that I was struggling, but I wasn't struggling against a bunch of people trying to exploit the situation. It felt far more kind to the people in power, that everyone was doing their best. Whereas in the original game, there were people in this game that were pieces of shit, and it just didn't come through in the same way. There wasn't that fundamental cruelty in a lot of the characters that was in the first game.
I don't know if that's entirely absent. I encountered a few situations where the game offered me bad choices, basically. One of the things that I don't know if they had the kids the secret stashes around the town in the first game.
No, I don't think so. I certainly didn't encounter them.
So this is one of the things I really liked that they added narratively and in gameplay. So the kids of the town, they're kind of weird because everyone in the town is, but the kids have these little boxes hidden all over town, filled with stuff, right? It could be thimbles and tweezers and walnuts and like junk, or it could be some medicine or something. And they play this game where if you take something, anyone can take something from the box, but you have to put something back. And if you are too greedy, they take their revenge on you somehow, right? And I don't know if you got the event where they take their revenge on you, because I was too greedy for a while. But
no, I never got that.
Okay, so basically, at some point, and I was being very stingy near the end of the game because I was really struggling.
Hmm.
I found a note in one of the boxes, and it says that the children have located a murderer. They've found the murderer who's been writing creepy notes in the boxes, and it marks the location on your map.
Hmm.
And so you go to that location and you get jumped by a guy with a knife, and you're like, oh shit, this must be the murderer. So, you kill him, and then you loot his body, and he has a note on his body. And on the note, it says, we, the children, have found the location of a thief. He's going to try and break into this house at this time. And it's like this fucked up, game that the children are playing to get two people who are stingy to kill each other, basically.
Brilliant.
That was like I felt manipulated then.
That's quite cool.
Yeah, and then similarly, there was a quest on like day 2 or 3 where Lara asks you to get a water barrel.
Yeah, and there's one poisonous one and one normal one.
Yeah,
right?
well, basically, I chose I was like, this is a terrible idea, and just didn't get her a barrel at all.
That's what I did. Yeah.
Yeah, and basically because of that district was spared from the plague for a day because she didn't bring all of these people into this one place, basically.
Mm.
So I think there's aspects of that DNA still here. I don't think it's as strong, like you said. And I do miss how... Well, I didn't know how much the Haruspex got into it in Pathologic 1. I just assumed it was missing because it was in the first game, actually. I figured that was more of a bachelor thing. But you're making it sound like it was present there, too?
It's more that a lot of the conversations had, like, if you were conflict orientated in the first game, you would get punished. Like you would get like a lot of the time you would just fail the main quest if you selected the wrong dialogue option. It was absolutely brutal. I missed out on getting like 4 serums for the panacea because I couldn't remember a children's nursery tale, if you remember, because so yeah, just quest failed, instantly lose. But like, for example, I made the changeling, I tricked her into telling me the nursery tale in the first place by saying, wow, that's such a good story. I would say the thing I miss is less the freedom of the character to manipulate back and more the density of the ways in which others were manipulating you. That's the thing that really feels like it's missing here. You're just kind of wandering from place to place, keeping up with stuff. And I do miss all of the interactions you had with the Bachelor in the first game, because the whole idea is the Bachelor is using the Haruspex as his, like, it's like, I want to be able to do this stuff, but if I try to, I'm just going to get killed on sight. So I need to use this, medicine man, this local medicine man, to do all this dirty work for me. You interact with him like once or twice, and then on day 9 he shows up again, but it's nowhere near as densely interwoven as it is in the first game.
There is the critical mass of interaction with your confidants just isn't there. I felt like in the first game, the people on my list I interacted with like every day basically, and I really got to know the characters. In Pathologic 2, like someone like Notkin, for example, was on my list, and I really only spoke with him on day 1 and 2, and then he just vanished from the story completely, basically.
And there's a reason for that, right? So we're going to slightly delve into mechanics here, but the idea is that people can die in this game. Yes. A lot of these characters can die. So they needed to write this story in such a way that characters were dying left, right, and center. They had to write this story with the idea that a lot of these critical characters could die, and the story would somehow have to go on. So once again, they're a lot more limited in terms of constructing a complicated story. I've been pretty negative, James, but I don't actually hate this story. It's just that
I think it's really good still. I thought that, and I didn't really get to experience it in my first playthrough, but I thought all my interactions with the kin culture was like, I got so much more out of that this time around. They seemed more fleshed out to me, at least. That's probably just because I did the Bachelor playthrough first, but I found in the first game, honestly, the choice at the ending to be like super easy. And although I think there is a correct choice in the ending on this game, I do felt there was like like there was a tension there. Like when I pulled that trigger, it felt bad, and I didn't want to do it, but it was obviously the correct choice.
Yeah, and
Whereas I was like, it was so easy for me the first time.
yeah, and I hope you kind of got an insight into why I felt what I felt about the, I guess, the spirituality connection I had with the first game. Kind of came through a bit stronger in this playthrough because you do go into the guts of the earth quite literally in
Oh,
this
that
game.
bit was awesome.
Yeah,
I really liked that. Yeah.
yeah, it's pretty impressive. It's a bit more. It's interesting in the. I don't know if I remember if you remember what happens in the first game. It's quite hilarious.
I walked there and I got knocked out.
Yeah, in the first game, you basically do all these trials for the foreman who's trying to kill you with these trials. And in the end, the final trial is to jump in a hole. And if you don't speak to the changeling first to get her to protect you, you jump in the hole and you die.
To die.
It's just, it's just.
I didn't do. Yeah, I don't
so
remember
funny.
any of that.
Yeah, no, it's
That's
quite,
great.
quite amusing. Yeah, the foreman's a very different character in this game. Did you Let's talk a little bit about the dialogue because I found and maybe the change in characters. It's
more succinct.
It's
right?
more succinct. There is some stuff, I guess, some philosophical perspectives, particularly when you speak to the mistresses. They still speak in kind of a loopy way, but in general, the dialogue is much more grounded and reasonable. And these characters, I think, feel more like human beings than they did in the first game.
Yeah, and I kind of lament that, honestly.
Me
I
too.
liked the insane ramblings about immortality and the nature of being from the Canes. I thought it was really enjoyable. That was like probably my favorite part of the game was the crazy dialogue. Honestly, it was just nuts. They've really humanized the characters here a lot more. Everybody's a lot more. They make a lot more sense in some ways, but
yes.
It's a very different experience in that way. And I do think it kind of adds to that feeling of like that lack of connection to the characters because you don't have them spill their guts to you every single sentence basically here. So there's a bit lost, I felt.
Yeah, what I would say is that I don't necessarily think this is worse because I think that it helps feed into the kind of experience that the gameplay is trying to create. Like they're really trying to drive home the suffering that everyone is going through, and everyone being a more grounded, reasonable human being makes the suffering feel more real. Whereas the first game with the more abstract dialogue, it just, like I said, that game, Pathologic 1, is like a fever dream. Yes. And thinking back on it, it feels like a fever dream, even in the way that the architecture is constantly taunting your abilities to navigate that bloody town. But I agree with you. Something is lost, and something ephemeral about that heady feeling you get while walking through the town and contemplating the latest dialogue you received has gone with the way these characters speak at you in a more direct way.
I don't think it's gone, right? I just think that it's less dense in every single conversation, and I think there is the same amount of information present in this game, but you can't get it in a single playthrough, is how I feel. I think that if you really go out of your way to talk to characters every day, that you might not have a quest for them, and talk to characters about those characters, I think you can get the same level of understanding about them. Maybe that's a bit less true with only the one playthrough, but I don't think all of that is gone. I just think it's spread out more, basically.
And that's fair. Although, like, the game really doesn't want you to just, spend 2 hours meeting a random character in the hope that they have a bit of dialogue, because that's not always how. That's like a very interesting use of your time in this game to do it on the hope that there's a bit of dialogue.
I do think that this game is more replayable than the first game by like a lot.
100%.
Right? Like
easily. Well, it depends. Like it depends if you consider the playthroughs as separate, because I think that the two to 3 playthroughs of Pathologic 1 probably offer more than replaying Pathologic 2 from a story perspective.
Yeah, probably. I got halfway through the Changeling route and just couldn't do it anymore. Like it was just very, very samey.
Famously, that's undercooked, so...
Yeah, although like there's not enough to do during the day basically in that game. Like I wish I could just halve the length of each day and I think it would basically be a lot more enjoyable. Whereas in this game I feel like I could still like on repeat playthroughs using gained knowledge to do better than my first playthrough, which
Mhm.
was admittedly a fucking huge train wreck. I died like 20 times or something. I was getting like because in this game
Man, what
if
a
you
noob.
die, yeah, if you die you lose max health like across all your save files. My character was on like he'd lost like a third of his health basically by the end.
Yeah, I only died 5 times because I'm a professional gamer, unlike you,
Yeah, I don't know
James.
how you did that. I have no idea.
It's pretty easy,
I
actually.
died constantly.
Yeah.
Um,
I'll be interested to hear more about those deaths.
oh
uh
yeah, I was just starving to death basically.
yeah, I was a trading machine. But yeah,
Yeah.
I'll tell you about my gameplay strategy that carried me to victory later.
Mm.
Okay, so my next point about the story, and this kind of ties into everything, and it's a very important part of Pathologic, one that we didn't spend an enormous amount of time in our discussion of the first game, is the fourth wall breaking, the meta layer, the fact that this is a stage play and it's not all happening, the fact that the developers are playing with you. How did you feel about
Uh,
this concept and how it was used in Pathologic 2?
strict improvement. Whereas the story and the characters, I think, is somewhat of a side grade. I think the way the meta narrative is framed and interwoven throughout the story, rather than being dumped on you at the end, is just so much better than the first game. Which at times it felt a bit shoehorned in. It feels like integral to the themes in the game this time around. I think they did a much better job of making it obvious from the beginning that that's what's going on. You know, there's these weird stage lights that appear in the town pointing things out to you.
Mhm.
When you think about the characters in terms of a play, like all the voice acting is done as if they're standing in front of a crowd, monologuing, you know, in this toneless voice.
And the way
Uh,
everyone's standing, even you walk into a building and people are like standing as if they're posing in for a
yeah,
play. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's much better, and I think they tie the themes of the game together with that much better as well, like the themes of choice, the idea of overcoming death, that kind of stuff. The introduction of the new character, I don't think the fellow traveler was in the original, but he fits in really well with the whole like thing that they've got going, and I think they're not removed, like you can see them as Easter eggs, but I like that they really didn't emphasize the children who are playing the game basically,
Mm.
because I
You
thought
do
that
see
was
them right at
you
the
do
end
see
though.
them
Yeah.
and in the very start of the game they're in the tutorial,
Yeah.
but I'm glad that it's toned down because the whole thing I think the theater stuff like is enough on its own basically.
Did you find that because the game is much more heavily tutorialized at the beginning of the game? Because
Yes.
at the beginning of the game in Pathologic 1 as the Haruspex, you basically speak to a couple of birds, and then they're
Yep.
like, good luck, have fun, and you have to stumble your way through it. I don't know if you remember, but when I first started playing Pathologic 1, my first playthrough, I was like, ooh, I had no idea what the game was. I thought it was like a walking simulator, so I was like walking around exploring the town. I wasn't doing any trading, I wasn't buying anything. I was just walking around enjoying all of the different places you could walk up to and going like, why is there nothing to interact with? Being very confused. Because I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know what the goal of the game was. I didn't know this was
Yeah,
a survival game.
this is also strict improvement. I think the game gives you the tools you need to succeed, but it doesn't tell you exactly the best way to use your tools. I think the fact that it teaches you at least the base mechanics and then lets you pretty quickly go off on your own is like a good thing. Like, I don't think the tutorials are overly long, but they are somewhat necessary, I think. And they do, I thought the whole like dream sequence intro thing kind of like fit really well with the whole game. I really enjoyed the like the conversations with the dude in the train.
Yeah, no, they are good, and on the whole, I quite like this as well. I will say that in some ways, I do think that the fourth wall breaking, I guess the subtler stuff that happens in the first game is a better fit for the fever dream that I remember Pathologic 1 to be. I think one of the interesting things about that original game is that the town is so strange already that the fourth wall breaking stuff just feels like yet another strange thing in the town. Whereas the more grounded, immersive feeling of Pathologic 2 makes the fourth wall breaking stuff very obvious in what it is trying to accomplish. I don't think that's a bad thing. I think it's a different approach, but Pathologic 1's surprisingly in some ways is more cohesive with that meta layer because it all, in the sense that the game is so strange and weird already that adding one more weird and strange thing to it doesn't change it as much as the dramatic impact it has in Pathologic 2.
Yeah, I can't really agree with that, honestly.
Okay.
To me, it's just a massively improved here, basically. I think that one of the strengths of the writing style, both in this game and the original game, is that the game never gives you direct answers to anything, basically. There are difficult questions about the nature of many characters, about the plague, about, lots of the events that are happening in the game. And while the game gives you information to work with about everything, it never directly gives you answers. I think that a large part of the message of the game and the things that it's trying to teach you are, it's about coming to your own conclusions. And I think that the meta-narrative stuff here much better guides you along that path, but without, answering things for you. I think the thing I didn't like about the children, I guess, at the end was that it was a weird conclusive answer to a game that was otherwise full of mystique and intrigue.
Yeah.
Whereas 2, I think, very consistently, does not give you clear answers to fucking anything.
Yeah, I agree that specifically the bit with the children is less interesting, but there's a meta-narrative thing going on where you have a conversation with the game developers at the end of the game, if you save. And that stuff is I find that stuff fascinating. Something that this game doesn't do because it's very caught up in this.
Really? Okay.
Well, it's very caught up in it being a play as opposed to like a video game, to the point where the original game flat out states, because Pathologic and Pathologic 2 do the thing where you don't have return to top dialogue menus. Once you commit to a dialogue choice, you are committed to it and your dialogue continues. And that's something that they specifically call out when the plague birds are speaking to at the end of the game. Specifically on this, I guess what I'd say is that I found Pathologic 1 to be a lot more obtuse. And that was massively to my detriment in the first game, to the point where I had to restart the entire game on day 3 because I was spending so much of my early game faffing about. However, that strict obtuseness in many ways made the experience more special as I was coming to grips with it. Is the obtuseness a good thing? No, it's not. But I kind of, coming into this game, having everything so readily explained to me so easily, it felt like it robbed the original a bit of the magic of what made it special. And I admit that isn't like a really good reason for wanting them to not do that. But it kind of shaved a bit of the rough edges off here. And I think I kind of liked those rough edges.
It's funny that you mentioned the lack of the developer commentary, because to me, in 2 specifically, Mark Immortal is like the developer's vessel, basically, is how it felt to me. Like, a lot of his conversations it felt like from the game's director, from the play's director.
I guess using the play as a framing device as opposed to a video game is kind of the difference. In the original, they were well aware that it was a video game that they were playing with the player, and that's kind of like the terminology they used. In this, they've gone with the play terminology and metaphor, and I understand that's a subtle difference, but it is a difference. And it makes sense, because I know that I can't remember the guy's name, but a lot of the meta-narrative is taken from a famous playwright, so it makes sense that they would continue to use the play theme. All right, James, I've got one more major note for story, and we've kind of touched on it slightly, but that's on the endings of the game.
Yeah.
How did you feel about the, and this isn't the meta narrative stuff, this is just the in universe endings. How did you feel about the endings of this game compared to the first?
So I think from what I remember, it's quite different to the original. But I think that in some levels, the endings are contradictory to what you're doing, but on another level, they're not. And I think that is kind of one of the themes of this game is this like ambiguity that kind of pervades the entire experience. Because to me, the option that you're given basically to destroy the polyhedron or not to, and destroy the town instead. And to me, the polyhedron is one of the most ambiguous and contradictory structures in the whole game because, on some levels, it represents the future and mankind's ascension to a higher plane of existence. But on the other hand, it represents stagnation, the children's inability to grow up. It's kind of both of these ideas at once, and because I think in Pathologic 1, the idea of destroying the polyhedron was destroying that idea of the future, whereas here they're leaning more into the idea of it being, a form of stagnation, the idea that immortality that Simon achieved and that the children are sort of achieving inside it does not, lead to the future, but leads to a world stuck in the past.
Yeah, it's more complicated, isn't it?
Yeah.
And it's harder still because we only have the Haruspex's perspective.
Yes.
But I think what you want to do is you want to go to Isildur. Is it Isildur? Artemis' father. And what he says is that the town is fundamentally broken.
Yes.
Like there's something wrong with the town, and it's not just the this wondrous construction. It's also the slaughterhouse and the way the kin are being treated. So his desire in unleashing the Sand Plague was to break the town down so that it could be built into something new. I think that this game does a pretty poor job with the kin. So
really, okay,
well,
that was the opposite of my feelings.
Well, in some ways, I mean, I think that it does a great job, kind of like showing us the kin and their culture, but it doesn't fully explore or give you the option to fully explore the ramifications of, I guess, post-colonialism. It seems like the kin are being exploited as slave labor in this town, effectively.
Yes.
And your final choice at the end of the game is, do I, do nothing and let the kin continue to live and let this plague kill a lot of people? Or do I destroy this polyhedron and save the people in the town? And I don't understand how, after spending the entire time playing the game, trying to save the town and save the people in it, because that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to develop the panacea. You could turn around at the end of the game and be like, no, I'm not going to save the people in the town. They can die. It's okay. I'm going to not destroy this polyhedron. It's fine for all these people to die to play.
I mean, the idea is you're saving half of the town and sacrificing the other half of the town. Your people, the kin, right?
But did you feel like, at least my playthrough, I didn't feel... I know that the game has you interacting with the kin a lot and you learn a lot about that culture. I did not feel anywhere near as close to the kin as the children I was trying to protect, because all of my quests were about protecting the children effectively. I kept using, schmouters on them to keep them alive. I was administering immunity pills. Everything I was doing was in service of creating this panacea. I think that if the game had started with me also helping the kin and trying to help them out, then maybe I'd have a more balanced perspective. But hell, I didn't even get the kin to like me until day 10. They weren't listening to me until day 10. Like, I don't know how you have the time to develop the same emotional connection with them.
At least for me, I felt it was pretty equally split between the two, actually. Like, it was stuck in the back half, but there was a lot of learning about the characters throughout the story. And I think that culmination on day 10 where you show your strength in a way. I don't know if you took the violent or the pacifist route for
pacifist. I did not have a knife, so I was like, yeah, we're doing I'm not going to try and kill these guys.
Yes, and I think you do like your connection through Asperty is your early connection to them, because she's basically your rock at the beginning, along with Big Vlad. I felt,
Hmm.
and I think her character's actually quite different than it was in the first game to some degree. I felt like even in the first game, her character model, I was unsure of like what age and gender, and like I had this character was such a question mark to me, and they're obviously like a creepy old woman in this one.
Aspity was in love with you in the first game as the Haruspex. Like it was like she was,
Really,
yeah, like it was far more. It felt far more romantic. Like a deeper love for you. Whereas this, she's kind of more of
she's like
a spiritual mentor in a lot of ways.
she felt like a mother almost. Is how I would describe it.
And I think that I've just been wrecked by Pathologic one because yeah, she was like deeply in love with you in that game. So I just couldn't see her as a mother in this game because I just had
Interesting.
her in my head as that. But I see what you're saying now. That does kind of fit.
Yeah, and I don't know. This is super spoilers, but I forget if they hinted this in the first game. But she's supposed to be like how Clara is hinted as being the embodiment of the plague. It's like she's the embodiment of the original plague 5 years ago, basically.
Yeah, I can't remember if that's the case
Yeah, or
in the
basically,
first
I
game.
think that's what it's hinting at, and I think her house being right next to the graveyard and that kind of
Hmm.
stuff, and her like how at the ending she's dying because you kill the Earth, basically.
Oh, right, that
I
makes sense.
I do think there was a connection there, and I think that any weakness in the characterization extended to the children as well, basically. Because really, for me, only Murky, my character, developed any kind of attachment to. I think a
Hmm.
lot of the other, maybe Sticky as well, but a lot of the others, I didn't get that density of conversation with to kind of develop that bond. And I think that's again the weakness of the more nonlinear storytelling. But definitely by the end I had a much deeper understanding of the people and the culture and what they were like. And although I guess I personally didn't resonate with them and their lifestyle, and because a lot of their practices are kind of barbaric, right? Like from an outsider's point of view, they're very tribalistic and ritualistic. They're very strange. They sacrifice people.
The whole argument that the kin make is like we need to, be less like individuals. If we're individuals, then then we're weak to the plague. We need to act with a herd mentality, and that's just so alien to the human experience and literally the Western liberal philosophy that we've grown up with of being an individual and expressing an individuality that it's hard for me to imagine most people properly resonating with these people and choosing to save them over saving innocent children. I don't, and listen, maybe I'm just self-inserting here, but I would never pick the kin over the children. I would always save the town 100% of the time. And I feel like this decision in Pathologic 1, when it was more of a decision between the town and the kin, were kind of like integrated, and you were trying to save both as opposed to splitting the people of the town with the kin. I didn't really like that dichotomy and that decision between the two because I'm going with the people I've been fucking trying to save the whole game. Like I'm not going to change my mind
Yeah, I
at the
think in
end.
the first game it was a bit more clear that the kids would be in the polyhedron and would survive if you blew up the town and destroyed the industrialization.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
but the idea was that at least for me, the idea is that that destroying the polyhedron was choosing the children, whereas saving the polyhedron was choosing those intellectual adults that the bachelor was associated with.
yeah, it's all a bit unclear to me, honestly, how it all fits together. I think
And that's
that's
fair, right?
somewhat the
Like it's
point.
a very confusing, muddy story, and I'm not trying to say I understand it perfectly either, because I certainly don't. But
Yeah, well, my experience was that I struggled on day 11. Like, when they came to me and I was like, man, there's like hundreds of years of like history, and there is, well, at least from the Haruspex' point of view, there is like a real god basically
mm,
living in the town underneath it that you are killing, this ancient being that's come into existence through hundreds of years of tradition and bull worship.
Well, that was the other confusing thing for me because in the original game, destroying the polyhedron was saving the bull.
Yes, they've
Because the
changed it. Yeah.
yeah, so I was like, I don't really understand. I've got to be honest, the ending didn't make a lot of sense to me.
Mm.
I didn't like. Yeah, I got to say, I didn't like that the way they did the ending. To me, the way it was done in Pathologic 1 was perfect. You know, choosing between the old ways and the new ways. So maybe I'm being stubborn here, James, and I'm not fully appreciating the change. But I'm destroying that polyhedron any day of the week, mate.
Yeah, well, I
As a
mean,
Haruspex
I
anyway.
ultimately did go through with that as well.
It does that mean like the Bachelor is trying to save the kin? Like that's weird. It's
I
just
don't
I
think he gives a shit about the kin.
yeah, I know, but do you see how it's all being flipped in a very odd way and how it's not as cohesive philosophically? Maybe someone smarter than me can explain it better, but to me it
I
doesn't
think
make
it's all
sense in the
about
same way.
the future and the past, basically, and from that point of view, it makes sense.
To me it was like, is it worth sacrificing these people, like these ordinary people that have been, you know, torn apart?
Murdering me and killing me for.
Well, that was what I liked about the original game. Like the Bachelor saw the town as a shithole, right?
Yeah.
Whereas the Haruspex saw the value of these ordinary people's lives, and so much of the original story was like the Haruspex perspective is that ordinary people, the people of this town, have value, and it is worth sacrificing this miraculous polyhedron that will go to the future to save the lives of ordinary people. And I connected far more deeply with that perspective than I did this ending, which I was just a
It's
little
the same,
confused
isn't
and
it? You save the
disoriented.
ordinary people by destroying the polyhedron.
Yeah, but the whole thing with the kin confuses things, right? Because now it's, am I doing this to, it's no longer a choice between the polyhedron in and of itself. It's a choice between the kin and the regular people in the town. So anyway,
I guess to me that doesn't make sense. Like for that even to be part of the equation, because the Haruspex doesn't value the polyhedron in that way at all. Like that's not what the choice is about. Basically, he has zero value on that aspect of the structure. It's all about the land versus the people, I
and
guess.
that's actually, listen, fair play. That's a good point because in my head, I guess I'm not in the head of the Haruspex in that moment. Like I think of the polyhedron from my point of view. I'm like, man, it feels bad to destroy this
Yeah,
when
he just
it's
doesn't
such a
care, right?
when it's strictly irrelevant to him. Yeah, so maybe that's what I'm missing. Maybe that's just not part of the equation. But
Mm.
I guess I really liked that dichotomy and that dichotomy of that ending, and it's changed here, and I didn't like it as much.
Mm.
So we've been talking about the story for a while, James. Can you give me an overall feel of where you are with the story? Because I've been very negative, but I want you to bring it back a bit so I can while I gather my thoughts.
So I think it's different. I think that this game's story doesn't invalidate the first games. I think that both games are worth playing together narratively, at least. Maybe not in terms of gameplay, but to me, they're both worth experiencing in their own ways. And it's difficult for me who didn't experience the original Haruspex playthrough. But I think that this game, the way it ties the gameplay into the narrative, is a lot better than they did in the original.
Mm.
So it's messy. It's not clear cut for me. There are aspects of this that I greatly appreciated, like that thing with the note, how the narrative kind of continues regardless of what you do, but still takes into account your actions. There's somewhat of a reactive feeling, although that is probably one of my biggest criticisms of the narrative is that it's not reactive enough for how disjointed it became. It's like they paid the price for making the gameplay more non-linear, but didn't put enough effort in to make the narrative decisions reactive, if you know what I mean.
Yeah.
It kind of feels like you could do 0 quests and you could still like successfully complete the game as long as you did the mandatory ones at the end. They would just happen regardless. And in some ways that ties into the meta narrative of fate and not being able to change things to some degree, but It wasn't as reactive as I was hoping. So I don't think that this game's story impacted me the same way that the first did, and part of that is because I'm experiencing the story for a second time rather than being, punched in the face with it for the first time. But it's still good. The world building is still excellent. I still love the town and its culture and its weirdness, and all of that still comes through in Pathologic 2. So, as a game, like, I think this is still one of the best realized worlds in a video game. Um, there are many aspects of the original that I prefer, but it's really hard to top the trade-offs in the gameplay, which we'll have to get to soon.
Yeah, and I think you hit on it. This feels like the narrative is in service of the gameplay, whereas I would say in the original game, the gameplay was in service of the narrative.
Yeah.
It felt like they wrote the story of Pathologic first for the original game and then came up with
some
gameplay
shitty
to support
gameplay
it.
after that.
Yeah. Whereas here it feels like they've created this deeply mechanical, interesting set of overlapping systems, and then they've kind of tweaked the story to fit those systems. So overall, I'm lower on this story than I am in the original, and even though they're similar in many ways, I think that most of the changes they've made to the narrative are ultimately for the worse, and I didn't enjoy it. And I mean, that doesn't mean it's bad. It just means that when there's a direct comparison, a super direct comparison, where I think one's done it better, it's impossible for me not to compare them. On the plus side, I do think there are some fantastic set pieces. The bit where you are infected with the plague when you're speaking to Murky's friend.
Oh yeah,
Excellent.
Yeah, that was excellent.
It's really impactful, and it's like a nasty surprise. The bit where the bell starts tolling and you make your way to the town hall with all of the reflections pointing you in the direction to go. And then you reach the town hall and everyone's there and everyone's perfectly staged, just brilliant. I think that a lot of the dream sequences are really effective. We didn't really mention them, but I thought that the theater... Did you do
all
the theater
them,
plays?
Yeah, most of them. I didn't get all of them, but they were massively improved, I thought.
Yeah, I think that they were just different. I wouldn't say they were better or worse. They were even more metaphysical and weird than the first game. The first game...
Did you die enough to release the rat?
Yes, that was my second last death. I think I died maybe one time after that.
Okay, well...
So I was on like day 10 or 11.
So you didn't have the big skeleton thing getting built outside the theater with every death?
No.
There's this giant skeleton that gets a new bone every time you die, basically.
Oh, right.
It's like bigger than the theater. It's gigantic, and the rat's like staring at it, telling you like how ominous it is.
I interacted with the rat after he escaped once. Yeah, so I think that was my... I only died four or five times the whole game, so I didn't really get that aspect. I think that the reflections, we didn't talk about them, but a lot of the time there are reflections in the same room that kind of reveal the inner thoughts of some of the characters you're talking to.
That was awesome. I
really liked that too. Yeah, it made these characters more sympathetic. I would argue in some ways too sympathetic, because they've transformed a lot of these, like I said, evil characters or terrible characters, ruthless characters into something a lot more sympathetic, which I don't think is always a good change in this game. Like, I think that having some truly vile people.
I think there are still some truly vile people. Like, Anna Angel is still a disgusting piece of shit.
Oh, yeah, she died like almost immediately in the game.
Yeah, good. Fuck her.
Yeah. But like...
There's Var, the scar-faced guy who sells organs and buys organs from you.
What do you mean? He's a great guy. He made me so much money.
Yeah.
But yeah, like, for example, Grief is a big softie. Sabarov is a softie. Like, they're all just trying their best. Oh, the change to the Foreman is the worst, because he's a big softie as well.
I think people like the Changeling's still a huge prick.
Yeah,
like one of
she's great. I like the Changeling in this game is better than the first, I think.
Absolutely, yeah.
So it's definitely not all bad, but these changes, for me, in a story point of view, were ultimately for the worst, and I'd say I was kind of disappointed. However, a lot of these changes were in service of gameplay, and let me tell you, this ain't the same game anymore.
Yeah, so let's go to the first music break because we're an hour in, and then we'll get to the gameplay. Yeah.
In a video game podcast, you think it's time to talk about gameplay, James?
Yeah. Well, we'll quickly go over the music and the sound. So this is really interesting, I find. So I think the OST for the original game is like one of my favorites ever. Like I fucking love every single song on that soundtrack. It's fascinating because I think the sound design itself is massively improved in the sequel here. But I think there are fewer tracks that are individually memorable. Like there are songs on the original soundtrack that I will open up on you and listen to occasionally.
I can hear them in my head, James.
Yeah.
I can just imagine them and they come to mind.
Yeah. There's a lot of ambient stuff in this game that doesn't have that same effect. But it's still good. It's just not as memorable. There are a few like set piece tracks that are like really, really moving. I think the song that plays during the tutorial and the one that plays just after you make the final decision are just both incredible pieces of music. And other than those two, I struggle to remember any in particular, but I do think it was a lot more immersive in some ways.
The key thing about this soundtrack is that it's meant to be enjoyed and experienced in combination with all the ambient noise in the background.
Yeah.
It's not a soundtrack that's really meant to exist in and of itself. And in that sense, I think it provides... It's the right soundtrack for this game.
Yeah.
Because it creates a more immersive experience and lets you sink into the immediacy of the gameplay far easier. For Pathologic 1, its soundtrack was the right kind of soundtrack for that game because Pathologic 1 ends up being a more meditative experience as you're walking and walking and walking and, maybe sidestepping every 30 seconds to avoid a plague cloud. But so I agree with you, James. Soundtrack is worse, but I think that if you were to just put Pathologic 1's soundtrack into this game, that would not have been the right choice.
I wouldn't call it worse. I think that the really good songs are really good still. There's just not enough of them. I will say the only thing that I think is strictly worse is there's no music that plays in Bad Grief's Warehouse. That was like my favorite track on the soundtrack.
God, I can just you saying that reminds me of what that song sounds like. My God,
yeah, it's so good.
That's why it's worse for me, James, because I just love Pathologic 1's OST. But I do think that this is the right soundtrack for this kind of game, and it's still an extremely good soundtrack.
So, did you have a song in particular that we can do for the break, Pat?
Yeah, so the one I was going to go for is, for me, one of the more memorable ones, and it's Miracle Workshop. So this is the song that plays whenever you're in the Haruspex's lair, and I'm pretty sure that while you can't remember many of the songs, James, this one will definitely ring true for you, because you spend a lot of time in that lair. Not necessarily for ages and ages, but you return to that as your harbor of safety quite often over the course of the game. So this is Miracle Workshop.
That was Miracle Workshop, and I could just hear Sticky saying, "You're a doctor, you should know," over the back of that one. That kid had a few very memorable voice lines while you were trying to cure the plague very ineffectually for the first few days.
Yeah, it's like you're one doctor. You should be able to cure this epidemic. Yeah,
he's
mate.
a child.
Clearly, he's a child.
What does he know? Yeah. So gameplay, and this is we're not going to stop talking about the story, I think, because it's so closely interlinked with the gameplay. But
I think we should start by talking about Pathologic 1's gameplay.
Oh
actually.
man, what a glorious game loop that was. So the first game to me had a problem where it lacked density for how much time you had in each day. So in both of the games, you play the 12 days continuously. There aren't any jump cuts between them. You just, you fade from morning to night over the
And the
course.
clock is ever ticking.
Yeah, the clock is constantly ticking down. Now, in the first game, what would happen is you would get 3 quests a day, basically, and you would do them, and I would normally finish by 3 p.m., and then that was it until the next day. There would be no more to do. So you just walked around the town picking and looting objects from bins, breaking into houses, and basically it was very monotonous, right?
And then it would get to nighttime, and then it was time to kill muggers bandits in the street. Yeah. And it was the same every single day. That's all you did. It was just walk around, trade with people, and then at nighttime you can't even trade with people because everyone's indoors.
Yeah.
And it was awful. Like it was, and I said I don't recommend Pathologic 1 to people, despite me saying how great it is, because this gameplay is so monotonous. It's so boring. Like it's really, really, really bad.
Is quite boring. And although I did mention earlier that I appreciate them, the time to think a bit more in hindsight, it's rough, and I struggled to play a second time because of it, although I feel like I could go back to it now and give it another shot almost.
I feel like the time you spend walking between quest markers, because the first game did a thing where it would like ping pong you all over the city.
Yeah.
Like you go to speak to someone, they'd say, "Oh, that person's actually over here," and then it would be at the opposite end of the town. You'd find them over there and they'd say, "Oh, but now you need to take this message to this person," so you'd be walking between. And that was less bad because you at least had a concrete goal. It was, as you said, that time after you finished the quests and you were just forced to grind for resources because not doing so wasn't optimal.
Yeah.
That the game really sank into it's so bad.
Yeah, and I think it's a problem of density. If there had been like 6 quests a day, so you didn't have that much time to yourself, it would have been much better, although still not great. I think a big drawback of the first game was that the survival meters, like your hunger and your stamina, etc., were too lenient. Basically, it was too easy to like get ahead in the economy and stay ahead. Whereas that was not my experience in Pathologic 2. I was like, by the end of the game, I was like barely able to keep going. Like I had nothing. I was like down on every single resource. And I think that's something the first game I thought did well, and I think the second game does even better, is that it would throw you economy curveballs where like on day 2 the price of food would double or something insane like that. They do that more often in this game and it's nuts. I felt like I was constantly having to rethink my strategies every day. It was pretty great.
Yeah, so we should jump into how the survival gameplay is different. Because I guess the two big differences, and this is a complicated video game, so we've got a lot of ground to cover. But I would say the two big differences are they solved the density issue. There's always stuff to do.
There's so much to do. There's more
so
than you
much
can
to
do in one. Yeah,
and so you've got that issue. And also from a survival perspective, you are always short on some kind of resource. You're never content. Whereas in the first game, the hobo economy, once you'd figured that out, you were set. Like you just were. If you didn't know what you were doing, you would starve to death and things would go wrong. But once you understood what you were doing in Pathologic 1, it was pretty cruisy. This game is not like that.
No.
Unless you're like a speedrunner or you've played this game multiple times, you are going to be suffering big time in at least one area majorly, whether you're starving, whether you're in danger of catching infection, whatever it is, you're going to be missing out on something, and you can never get it quite right.
And it gets harder and harder every single day. Like, they throw curveball after curveball at you. And even like the concept of time starts working against you. Like, the days get shorter, but that, like, your meters fill faster. Like, you get hungry quicker, so you have to be like more and more efficient with your movement, and like you just have to prepare, and they just take things away from you. Like, for a large portion of the game, for example, like, you rely on trading with children for a lot of resources. At the end of the game, the army rocks up and the children aren't allowed to leave the house. So you just lose access to these important trading partners forever. Is stuff like that just is so cool. I really enjoyed it.
It's kind of interesting because when we both played Pathologic 1, you definitely grasped this concept of the hobo economy faster than I did, because I definitely struggled a lot more than you did. Part of that is that the Haruspex playthrough was harder. Like, you just have less resources to deal with, but still, you figured it out faster than me. It seems like we've had the opposite effect here.
I got shit on real.
Like I said, I only died 4 to 5 times, and by using my... so my strategy, James, was, I don't know if you did this, but I was a fucking optimization machine when I was playing this game. In a lot of ways, I played it from day one, understanding that the hobo economy was an important thing. I was going hard at that. I was trading for all of the nuts and the pieces of garbage from shops, because I knew that they would ultimately be able to be traded up in value to children. I was, once I figured out the dead item shop was buying a lot of crap and sold a bunch of stuff, I was collecting all of the bloody bandages and broken morphine capsules I could, knowing that they'd pay off later. Did you engage with looting much in this game?
More than I did in the first game, a lot more, I think. But I was, I don't know, because most of my deaths actually came from getting into combat with people, and then just getting knifed to death. Or like being in a house and having 3 people in the same room try to kill me. Because I think in this game, fighting one person, you've got pretty good odds. Fighting 2 people is scary, and fighting 3 people at once is like you're going to die.
Yeah, so I wouldn't fight people. I was pacifist until like day 10 when I got a knife, and I think I would have found the game even easier if I'd actually gone out and actively tried to acquire a weapon earlier. I would, when I was looting houses, I would go into a house, and then if anyone spotted me, I'd immediately run.
Right,
and then rinse and repeat, because in a burned out district, there are so many houses to go into. So even if you go in a house and someone immediately spots you, you can just safely leave and go into the next house. In general, though, more specifically with my trading strategy, James, I was not trying to plan. Because one of the things that's interesting about this game is that in the original game, vendor junk, the shit you trade to kids, that was its only value. This game does something far more interesting in giving a lot of this stuff value.
Multiple uses, right?
Multiple uses, yeah, in terms of upgrading your inventory. Even the water bottles are also used to create potions.
Yeah.
So water bottles are both a thing to deal with exhaustion. They're something you can trade to drunks to get healing items, which can later turn into bandages. Use bandages that you can sell at the dead item shop. Yeah, or you can make potions with them. So they're very multifunctional and this is true of pretty much every single item in the game.
One thing that I had a big trouble with, in the first game, there was like half as many NPCs, I think, and that made it easy to remember what sold what. I still barely remember who sells what in this game. There's so many different vendors. I think I saw somebody who would trade bandages for water like twice in this game.
They are rarer. There were a lot more drunks in Pathologic 1. But the bins, you got to hit the bins because the bins give you so many water bottles. I was
Yeah, yeah.
drowning in water. I don't understand the people who have problems with water. Water was like my most traded resource. Every time I found a drunk, it's like goodbye all of my water.
Near the end, I was running, like, I wasn't running short of bottles. I just couldn't get water sources. Like, I repaired like 4 or 5 fountains, and they each rebroke like a day later.
So the trick is you want to refill from water barrels, and water barrels will only have water in them in the fine districts. So if a district's been burned out or it's infected, you can't get
Sometimes.
it. Sometimes, yeah, but I would if you're carrying around 24 water bottles, you will find a and you fill it up completely when you find a barrel. That will last you until your next barrel. So as long as you've got a density of water bottles, you're kind of that water problem was solved for me from like day 4 or 5 onwards.
Yeah,
It was difficult until then though.
I didn't proactively do it like until like day 4 or something, I think.
Right.
I think I didn't try to game it with my knowledge from the first game as much on the early days, and that
Oh
kind of
man,
like
that's a mistake.
yeah, that snowballed me into this like really rough state later on because I had like nothing constantly. And then when I got infected and I just had to like I went like 4 days with the plague or something later on because I had no because I saw so many schmouters like cures for
Hmm.
the plague on the first 3 days, but never had enough to trade for them. I got one out of an item box, and then had to use that on Notkin like immediately.
Hmm.
So I didn't because I was like, oh, if I don't use it on him, I'll have to keep like curing him every day, and that'll eat my resources. So I'll do that immediately, and then I just never found one to cure my own plague until I went into the abattoir and it cured it for me,
Yes.
basically.
See, I was a lot luckier with Schmouters. Like, I probably found 5 to 7 over the course of my playthrough.
Mm.
I traded for 2 from kids. The dead item shop trade gave me like 3. Well, I traded for 3, and I got a couple from those children's stashes. So I suffered with infection for a while before saying I cannot do this anymore. This isn't a long term strategy, and I
It's
cured
fucked,
myself.
hey.
So
You get really it adds up quick. Like once you start getting like I don't know, like 10% of your infection bar, it just starts like draining your health constantly and
yeah.
making you tired and
And
yeah,
if you use the item that lowers infection, it does a bunch of damage to your
damage to your
health.
health. Yeah, then you have
Yeah.
to sleep to get it all back.
And then in that time the infection builds up again. So
Yeah.
you're really
And your
paddling
hunger
water
goes
here.
up.
Like you're suffering, and then you're spending money on and trading for things that you would prefer not to use. Yeah, it's not good being infected, and I strongly recommend using a cure on yourself if you've got one.
Yeah, I
Because
couldn't
it's very
find one.
painful.
So yeah,
Yeah.
so that whole 3 day section just like I went to nothing and all my bars almost maxed out constantly.
Yes.
And it was about then when before the army rocks up and there's heaps of bandits that aren't being shot, and I had like no health because I was infected. That was like I was really struggling to make progress. I was like leaving my house, like getting chased and then getting like one hit by something constantly. It was so bad.
Yeah, so I was struggling the most around days between like days 5, 6, 7. Like that's
Mm.
when I struggled the most. But it's funny you say that you had the hardest time the end of the game, because I found the end of the game to be so easy. Like I at that point I was just like I was just coasting along. And when I got the knife, the game was basically easy mode. Like I felt like I couldn't lose. Those last couple
Really?
of days I
Okay.
had so much food. I was doing the hospital
Really?
quests. I was doing the
Man.
hospital quests every day, and the last one, when you use a schmouter on a patient, gives you so much money and food. Like I used my money to
Right.
get like a full clothing set, like high tier clothing set at the end of the game, just
Okay.
because I had so much money.
So I couldn't do the quests from the day where you have to stand in there for like an hour with the plague
Yes.
clouds. I tried that, and
Yeah.
I kept getting hit by the clouds, so I just had to it ate too much of my stuff. I was like,
Right.
I'm reloading, and I'm just not doing it from this day. And then the next day was use a schmouder, and I didn't have any, so I didn't do the hospital quest from
Yeah, that
like
would have
day
hurt.
6 or something.
Yeah, see, I did that quest, and because the other upside of having so much water is that I had so many immunity boosting drinks
Right.
that I was, and because I'd been so proactive in trading, immunity boosters is an item that a lot of the children have. And because I was pushing that angle so far, I had a big stash. In fact, I was at a point where I was trading immunity boosters with people because I had like 11 of them. So I was like, I need to get rid of these. That's something I generally did a lot, James. Like if I had a lot of a resource, I wasn't like, this could come in handy later. I was like, get rid of it. If I can get rid of this, get rid of it. Because I knew that trying to plan and be careful and compensate, and hope that for the future I'd get a use of it was far less useful in a game like this than getting what I needed now. Because if I could get what I needed now, it would let me keep surviving. If you just try and plan for every contingency, you will never have enough for every contingency.
Man, and that was me who was like trying to figure out how to get from one point in the town to the other without dying from hunger, and was like, okay, I can do it if I eat 3 walnuts. And
Oh, really?
yeah, like I was
My
eating those
God.
things, and that was like the difference between me living and dying in these sections. Like I was in a real bad way.
Wow. Yeah, because it
I was,
never got
like,
that bad for me.
struggling.
I was just proactively trading for the expensive food whenever I could. Like food, I think I just, because I'd gone through the trials of Pathologic 1, like I went into this game all guns blazing and I didn't waste a moment.
Yeah.
This game,
I guess
Pathologic 2 demands you strategize and not every time, because time is the god of this game, because the clock is always ticking, every single step counts. And so this was a very stressful game to play because I had to be 100% switched on with a clear objective of what I was trying to achieve at all times.
Yeah, I guess me not get it. So on the days where like later on you can't use money to buy food anymore, and
Now, did you trade for the vouchers with Death?
I traded for 1 voucher.
I got about 6 or 7, so I was pretty well set up.
Yeah, and then I got like 2 more or something. I think I argued with the lady, and she only gave me 1 like a day, so I was not using those at all. Basically, they got me like a lemon.
A single lemon.
Yeah.
Hey, lemons are good.
Yeah, they give you stamina.
Yeah.
Yeah, but honestly, like even though I was struggling, like it was fun, like trying to work everything out. You have to like, there's this constant battle of like planning your routes efficiently and planning how to spend your resources. Honestly, I'm kind of glad that I struggled because it meant like I had to be super careful with my stuff. Like every single thing, like every time I found like anything, right, it was like, oh my god, that's so good. I was breaking into houses because they give you like clothes fairly often, which more of it like I sold more often than wore because they were just too valuable.
To make it clear, I think I don't want to make it sound like, oh, this game is easy, because it was not easy.
No.
Like it's not like I was in a great shape at all times. It's not like I was not running low on resources. I just think that I went into this game with the correct aggressive mindset, and that helped me get over the hump basically and stay ahead of the game trying to kill me. But let's dive a bit more into the details of what this strategizing entails, James.
Sure.
So let's talk about a typical day. Okay, so you wake up in the morning, your hunger's kind of low, your immunity's at about half, and you get a quest. The quest is inside an infected district. What do you do? Well, you need to get to that infected district, so you need to plan a path. But the path from one location to where you're trying to go is influenced by a whole bunch of factors. You have to think, what shops are on the way? There is a second quest over here. What is my routing going to be between this shop I want to visit, this place over here, and this place over here, and what path am I going to take? Is my immunity high enough, and are my clothes in good enough condition to cut through this other plague district, or should I take this slightly longer path to get around that plague district so my immunity takes less of a hit? There's a burned out district here. I could loot some houses on the way, but my health is kind of low. Are these bandits going to kill me if I try and take this path? Oh, I have some fingernail tokens. These can be used to fast travel between locations, but I can't fast travel from infected districts, only into districts. Oh, if I go through regular districts, I have the opportunity to trade. Do I have excess materials in my inventory to trade with children? Or should I do some looting first so I do have excess materials to trade with children? And then when you finally get into the infected district, you have to make the decision, oh, do I loot in this infected district which contains the most valuable loot? Or do I just try and leave it as fast as possible? And you're trying to think all these things simultaneously. You're trying to carry all this information in your head. And what it is a giant puzzle of opportunity cost.
Yeah. And as you're at your den and you've planned all of this out in your head, and you go out into the town and suddenly this other quest pops up, or you're walking past a burnt out house and you hear this baby crying, and rescuing babies is super valuable because it improves your reputation across every district, gives you heaps of rewards. But it's dangerous because it's like you're very likely to get hit by multiple plague clouds in there.
Oh, and your cloth mask is just broken, so your immunity is dropping at a faster rate than you originally anticipated.
Yeah. It's just like a constant cycle of reevaluation. And also, like, the game is split up into acts, so you kind of have these, like, long-term goals as well that you're trying to achieve. Like, in the mid-game, you're sort of trying to brew as many different types of potions to find which one's the cure. So you kind of, like, you want to interact with the plague towns enough to get infected organs because they are good for brewing potions. But organ harvesting is very dice rolly, and it requires good tools to do efficiently.
Which costs money or needs to be traded for otherwise. And that's money that could have been spent on bread.
Yeah, and every day they throw a new curveball at you, like suddenly you can't spend money on food, or, or the water barrels are broken. You planned your route through this district because the water fountains are working, but they're actually broken when you get there, and now you're out of water. All this kind of stuff. It's fun, actually. Like, it's very engaging. Like, it's way more engaging than the original's monotonous walking through the park looting every bin. And I'm still just looting every bin. Like, I don't think that the core concept of the gameplay has changed at all. It's just like 1,000 times denser and more interesting, and
it's been expanded
realized
in every direction.
Yeah.
I think one of the, and I mean, we've kind of touched on this, so the way the infection works is that each day districts get infected, then those districts burn out, and then they return to normal. So districts are in 3 states. They're healthy, they're infected, or they're burned out, and it changes every single day, and you don't know which are which unless you either purchase maps from Notkin's crew or you physically run into them. Like, you go to the border and you can see them, or as you walk into them, it'll pop up and identify them.
Did you get maps from Notkin in the first game? Because I got them from Young Vlad every day.
In the first game?
Yeah.
In the first game, I think you could trade for maps. Like, they were trading needles or something. I didn't engage with that mechanic.
Okay, because Young Vlad sold me a map for, like, I don't know, a pittance of gold every day.
As the Bachelor.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I'm pretty sure you traded for them with Notkin, and it's not something I did in the first game. So
yeah, I didn't even speak to Notkin in my first playthrough. I didn't know he was a character.
Yeah, so they can give it to you, but otherwise, what will happen is, as James said, things change. You will plan a route through the city, and that will take you from one infected district to a second infected district. So you end up in infected districts far longer than you were trying, and the whole time. In the first game, the way disease worked, it was terrible. Like a lot of mechanics in the original, it was very binary. There were disease clouds, and if they hit you, you got infected. And there was, like, unless your immunity was at 100, you were going to get infected. And it was very hard to keep your immunity at max in that game, because, like, in this game, it drops to 50%. So in this game, being in an infected district constantly reduces your immunity until you go indoors or leave the district. So you have to keep taking immunity boosters, and there are still those plague clouds which do massive damage to your immunity, probably like 40%. I saw some brown ones as well, which in the original were a lot scarier. I never got hit by one, but I'm assuming it would do more damage.
I never saw one, actually.
Yeah, I saw a couple
saw
towards the end of the game.
Ones.
Yeah.
I never saw the angel clouds.
I think those are the brown ones, right?
Yeah, maybe, or the red ones.
Yeah.
And then there was the rats, which aren't in this game.
Yeah, well, there are rats, but they don't do anything. They're just present sometimes.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh yeah, that's right. There were, weren't they? I remember now.
Yeah, and they chased you.
Yeah, they chased you. Man, that's
Those
so
things
it was so bad. You just kind of backed up and stabbed them. So it just reminded me of that. Oh, so shit. Anyway, that you play through the game and you're constantly thrown curveballs, but they're all like dynamic curveballs, and all of these things are emerging entirely naturally from the gameplay mechanisms. And you can see why people think of this game as an immersive sim, because it's built all of these systems into the game, and these tricky, awesome situations just emerge entirely dynamically. And your individual playthrough is going to be completely different from mine, completely different from James, because you're going to have problems in different areas at different times over the course of the game.
Yeah, there's elements of randomness and variance in this game that are going to throw everyone down different paths. Like, who gets infected is... You can influence it, but it's a dice roll, basically. I think it's in your favor to some degree. But yeah, and like actually helping infected people get better or stopping them from dying is a bit of a chance game as well. By playing doctor on them. Combat is it feels a bit janky and a bit up to chance. Like you can...
So you start using the sneak, then it's deterministic.
Yeah.
This is like, I didn't engage with the combat at all, like I said, until like day 10, and then I got a knife, and it is very easy to sneak up on bandits and get a guaranteed kill on them, and then you get their resources. It was very easy. It's better than the first game's stealth because the enemy bandits in that game walk just as fast as you, and of course they had the infamous throwing knives that did 90% of your health bar.
So bad.
So it's definitely an improvement, but it's still not like a... I don't know, they're kind of more obstacles to be avoided than... I don't think combat's really a thing that you should enjoyably engage with in this game.
Yeah, definitely trying to do it led to a lot of deaths.
Did you ever get a gun, James? Because I never had a gun the entire game.
I got it off Lara's quest at the end. Did you do that one?
Lara died in my playthrough.
Oh, okay, yeah, because she tries to shoot the general like she did in the first game, and you just convinced her to give you the gun.
Nice. Well done.
Yeah, which I immediately...
And then you're like, now I have the gun.
Yeah, and I immediately sold it for a loaf of bread because it's actually so useless. Dude, the reload animation for like a 6-shot revolver takes probably like 30 seconds. Like, it's like 5 seconds of him getting the bullet out of his pocket, putting it in, getting the next... It takes so long, it's crazy. And then what'll happen is you'll shoot one bullet... It'll like either kill them or not kill them, and then the gun will jam immediately. They're so useless. I sold it for bread like within the hour.
Yeah, it seems like a knife is just going to be better in
I think lockpicks are the premium weapons.
Weapon for murdering.
Yeah, those things are highly valuable. Everyone wants them. They're not that expensive off good old boy grief.
To dive a bit more into some gameplay specifics, I want to talk about looting a bit, because I actually really like looting in this game. It's something that I think is far better implemented than the first game, and a lot of it is to do to the tactile, mechanical feel of it.
Yeah.
So
it's the UI, right?
It's the UI, yeah. So the way looting cupboards work is you press E to interact with a lootable object, usually cupboards and things like that. And you get a little pop-up of it with all of the different handles.
And drawers,
and then you hold all the drawers, you hold down a button and it will gradually spin, and then the drawer will pop open. And you never know what's going to be in there, whether it's something immensely valuable or often nothing. And it's the same with the lock picking. The lock picking in this game is really good. Like it's very simple, but it has this tension to it where every single click, yeah, you basically have to reach balance on two sides with both of your mouse clicks. So you go click, 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 and every time you click, it does a little bit of damage to your lockpick. But the trick is that it's not easy to line up both sides correctly. There's some zones which take more clicks to get through than others. So you have to kind of click a lot in order to get into a location where it unlocks, but you're really scared of clicking too much or clicking mindlessly because your lockpick will break because you've been careless. So it's kind of condensed the tension of lockpicking of the entire game into a mini game, and it's the best lockpicking mini game I've ever experienced. I loved it.
I didn't like have that reaction that you're having, but it is good. It's not like it doesn't take long, and it's thematic, and the sound effects are great.
Better than the System Shock 1 mini game, right?
Is there anything worse? I thought looting was much more interesting in this game, honestly. Like, the UI in general is much better. The UI in this game's actually really good. Just like for looting, how objects have this sense of weight to them, and they're not actually like modeled in the game world at all. There is not like a single item other than maybe like the knife and the lockpicks that you can see as a 3D model in the game. They're all pictures in your inventory, because you only interact with them as containers. But they all make different sounds when you drag them and drop them in your inventory. They all have different descriptions and stuff like that. So they feel, and they're all different sizes in your inventory. And I think it gives them a real like sense of like existence, even though, you know, they're ultimately just different size JPEGs, you know?
Yeah, that's actually a really good point. That bread and the meat, they feel like real breaded meat, don't they?
Yeah,
like you really feel them. And this is the strength of menu-based design, right? I'm often complaining about, you know, games not using menus enough. This game makes extensive use of menus. Like there are so many menus. Everything's a menu in this game. And it's fantastic because of it.
Yeah.
Like the game isn't less immersive because there are menus. It's just that for PC gaming, menus are far and away the best way to do this kind of thing. And I wish more games would have a UI like Pathologic. I think in many ways it's probably one of the best UIs I've ever encountered. Like it's just perfect.
While we're on this subject, let's talk about the mind map, because this is the best thing in the entire game, bar none. It's like the most innovative thing that this game does, and I hope that I want to see this in more games, because normally quest journals or similar are terrible, right? They're
confusing.
You don't know how to navigate poorly organized.
Them, yeah.
If they fill up with like 10, it makes me uncomfortable, and I want to delete some to make it more, you know, natural. They tell information very poorly, and they very poorly track the history of your playthrough. So Pathologic 2's UI, the mind map, is its version of a quest journal, and it is a visual interface that tells you all sorts of things. Like, it's not just tracking quests, it's tracking the context behind the quests, it's tracking what you haven't found, even if it's not shown. Like, what it is this black screen that has these little circles with pictures in them that you can hover over for a description that says, this character said I should do this, and then it'll have a little line that branches off into a dotted outline with nothing in it, and you have to figure out how to progress that part of the quest. And from day to day, your mind map will have like 10 different incomplete sections around it, and they're all like kind of grouped together logically based on how the Haruspex kind of internally thinks of all of these things. And even when there's like a black space in the middle of the map, you can infer that something is supposed to belong there. And based on what's around it, you can kind of figure out how to unlock the quest in that section. It's really cool.
Also uses bubble size to determine importance, which is important.
Yeah, and
it's not just like a bunch of circles of the same size, they're subtly different.
Yeah, it's awesome. Like, and they change based on like the decisions you make when there's branching options. Like, it doesn't.
And new information you get.
Yeah. It's
really good.
It's awesome.
I agree, James. This is the next innovation in quest logs. Like, it's perfect for this game. Like it fits it perfectly because this game a lot of ways plays out like a detective game. Yeah. There's a lot of mysteries that you're trying to solve in this game. Identities of killers, what's going on with the plague, what different characters are up to, and what they're trying to achieve, and having that slowly unravel gradually as you piece together what's going on is wonderful. I actually went back to the previous acts, the maps, just to look at them. Yeah, because it was enjoyable to read through and understand what the Haruspex was thinking. It's brilliant. It's just straight up brilliant. And for all of my criticisms of the broader narrative strokes of Pathologic 2, the way that this internalized thought structure is delivered as a story mechanism and a gameplay mechanism is top tier. And I think that there's nothing to criticize here. It's just wonderful. And like video games, I want to see other games use this. Like Return of the Obra Dinn could have used a mind map like this. Like having a menu like this, so maybe you could argue that would ruin the game, but I would think that it's a really good way to present related nuggets of information in this way. It's just a really good thing.
I really liked how it guides the player without spoon feeding them, just by the location of the thoughts relative to the other thoughts. Like you can figure stuff out based on that.
It lets you know there's more to discover in that area, so you're not wasting your time as well.
Yeah.
Once all the nodes are filled, you know, okay, I've finished this area.
And the map isn't a set size either, so you can never really be sure that there is nothing on the outside of it. But you know, you'll find some weird things here and there. But I think it doesn't give the game away entirely, which I like. And the ambiguity of the series, you know, it plays into that really well.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. I think it's a great point.
All right, so let's go to the next music break, and then we can continue discussion, I guess, as we go along one, I feel. So I'm going to pick the best song in the soundtrack, which I'm not going to pronounce this correctly, so forgive me. Volka Yoda, by
pretty good.
which is the the thing that plays at the end of the game in the middle. I think it's really evocative. I think they nail it. The singer does a bang up job on this song. It is just fantastic. So here it is. Right, that was my favorite piece of music in the entire game. I think that while I love the original soundtrack to bits, I think that that song in particular does a really good job of stirring emotion and the really critical points of the story. So, 10 out of 10 pieces of music, best song on the soundtrack, maybe Darkness is a close second, but really good stuff. Alright, so I think we've touched most of the major stuff. I just want to spend a bit of time going through tidbits that I thought the game did really well. I think there's some inclusions in the narrative that I really enjoyed. Stuff that I didn't experience at all in the Bachelor's route, like the Rat Prophet stuff, I believe, was in the first game, but only in Haruspex only. Yeah, I never saw any of that. I thought the encounter with Grace in particular in that whole section I thought was really cool. I thought that the way that the stuff with Sephiroth was handled with the changeling requesting and the monkey encounter was awesome. Honestly, I was like my biggest disappointment narratively probably is that we don't see the Bachelor and the changeling enough because they're by far the most compelling characters, and I think part of that is because they went into it expecting to make the rats for the other two characters, so you don't need that in individual playthroughs, but
I disagree. I think that's the heart of the problem. I think that when they wrote the original game, and obviously I don't know for sure, that they wrote it all cohesively in one overlapping narrative. I think the problem with this is that they wrote the Haruspex by itself, and they probably had a vague idea of what the Bachelor and the Changeling were doing, but they weren't finished. Like, they hadn't actually fully rewritten that part of the story. So as a result, it feels a bit empty because that density of the world building isn't there.
yeah.
And I mean, this is a thing that happens. Like, it's not always like. Obviously, there'd still be a lot of stuff we didn't see. We should have felt the subtle ramifications of other stuff happening, and that is something that happens in the first game as Haruspex. You can feel the strings being tugged, even if you're not the one pulling them, right? In this game, I just didn't get that feeling, and I think that's a big reason why I enjoyed the story of the first one better.
Yeah, me too. Okay. And then the only other thing was, now that we've talked a bit about the gameplay and its impact on the story, I do think, and I did mention this earlier, but I do think the game is narratively very active enough. I think I don't think it even can be realistically. Like, I feel like my decisions in the first day, they had a knock-on effect, and it rippled throughout my survival meters and the way that I prioritized where to go through the town. It never really shook up where the narrative went, and my only real decisions that affect the outcome of the story happen at the end. Whereas I thought with this more open-ended structure that you would have these decisions early that would continuously come back to bite you throughout the whole game.
We actually talked about this at the end of Pathologic, about what we were hoping to see from Pathologic 2, and one of them was difficult narrative decisions. Like, what I wanted from this game, I guess, with this kind of structure was, here's some medicine, these two people are infected, you can save one.
Yeah.
Like, you can, and variations on that theme. Oh, this district is infected, we can burn it to the ground, and it will create a safe zone in these two neighboring districts. Do you raise it to the ground, or do you let the infection stay? We get so much gameplay ramifications in this way that we've been over it. The whole game makes Resident Evil's opportunity cost decisions. It's a game that we love to pieces. Look, even file in comparison. Like, this is survival opportunity cost really pushed to its limit, and it's fantastic because of it. But you don't have narrative opportunity cost decisions in a way that you would think would flow naturally from the brilliance of the first game.
I think it's a budget problem, right? Like, when you do that stuff, you have to write so many versions every day in order to keep things coherent as spiral forward from your decision making. Which I get why they have to go this route, but that is, to me, that's the ultimate fantasy of a real imagining of this world.
Continuing with the story discussion, I know that you were still struggling to you feel like the story heated out a bit towards the end? Because I definitely felt like the last couple of days I was suddenly having more time on my hands. Like I had more time to do miscellaneous looting and stuff like that because it seemed like, and I mean that kind of makes sense, right? The game's coming to a climax. But what I was expecting, and this is something the Pathologic one does, is that I was expecting that by the end of the game, everywhere would be infected. But the game very rigidly stays with its structure of, there are one third of the town is safe, one third of the town is infected, one third of the town is turned out. I thought it would just get worse and worse and worse until there were no safe parts of the town.
Man, you had a very different experience to me. One of the big plot points, you know how you had heaps of schmatter?
Yes.
Okay, at the end of the game, there's this bit where you talk to the incarnation of the plague directly, and he's basically like, fuck you, and infects every single person on your list.
Yep.
Man, that was such a mad dash, and like half of mine died anyway.
Because I saved, so I had, because I had, you go through that linear cell section to get the blood in the bottle, so I ended up getting 3 because I drank a couple before I knew what I was doing. So I ended up getting 3, and then I had 2 schmouters, so I was able to kill 5 of the 7, and then I gave immunity pills to the other 2, and one of them survived and one of them died. So in the end, 6 of my 7 survived, which I was pretty proud of because it was a bit of a scramble, but I got there. I think
3 or 4 of mine died. Like Grace died, not Murky specifically, because it was like I fucking dealt with like 3 days of being infected for this idiot, and I'm not right now. He died like halfway through the game randomly, like on a 5% dice roll or something.
Yeah, the only person that died was the Planetary Girl, the Mother Superior. The rest survived because I'm a great healer, unlike you, James.
Yeah, well, I mean,
it's a roll schmouters. That's the trick.
Yeah.
Basically, every night.
I didn't have enough time to keep myself alive, basically, like, and keep them alive. There was this, like,
she's like right in the corner of the map as well, near nothing. So it's a big trick.
Oh, no, she hadn't, at that point in the game, I hadn't sent her down there, so I cured her.
Oh, okay.
So on that day, I had to cure her in cemetery, then send them down there. And then what I had to do was I was out of herbs, so I had to run there anyway. And what I had to do was I had to start the day from scratch, and I had to time it so that as I was talking to the NPCs and getting the like 50 herbs off the ground, it would tick over to 2 p.m. and the Inquisitor would call me to the cathedral and it would teleport me back to the town. So I didn't have to run back. Yeah, I had to save time by doing that. That's how I think. Like my puzzle was fucked at the end. It was like I was like eating nuts to survive, basically.
Did you figure out that when you're in the boats that you don't lose hunger or thirst?
No, but I did notice that sometimes it's slower.
Yeah, so basically you can use that as a hack almost because it's like, or is it exhaustion that doesn't go down? Yeah, I think it's exhaustion. So you can use it, it's like 11. It's basically when you travel by boat, it's also giving you energy back.
Yeah.
So you want to travel by boat whenever possible. Like I would trade anything for fingernails. Like they were so useful. And when they start asking for 2, it's still worth it. Like
Man,
that was it. That screwed me over though. When I went to the first one, they're like, yeah, you need 2.
no.
I have exactly 1. And this was what I played my whole bloody strategy around. I had so many herbs at the end of the game, man. I had like stacks of 25.
Oh, geez, no, I was barely like I had to go get more on the last day.
Yeah, it really sounds like
I also only
aggressive determined strategy in the early game really saved me.
I also only was able to use one of the potions I made. Like I only worked out the kidney one because I never found anyone who like I made the brain potion and nobody ever needed the brain like that one. So I never got to like fill that bit. So I didn't get the dream thing that gets you the blood at the village. I don't know if you
I didn't get that either.
Okay, sure. Yeah, because you need to do like 3 of them or something before the
I was really bad with that. I was actually starting to panic.
Yeah, I thought I wasn't going to make
I thought, well, that's what I thought it was. I was like, oh my god, because I spent all put all of my effort into doing the quest and staying alive. And I was like, oh, I get what this game is doing. I'm not going to be able to cure anyone because I haven't been putting effort into upgrading my machine. I thought because I hadn't upgraded and tinkered with my machine to the max level that I wouldn't be able to make cures. And then it just lets you do it anyway, which I'm grateful for, but that would have been a nice anyway.
Yeah, I don't think they can do that.
The original game also had different endings depending on how many people you saved. I don't think it's got that. Unless there's a hidden ending if you save everyone. I don't know.
I don't think so. Maybe they do. It was less reactive in that way because you get to, if you save not just your people but the other two people, you get special endings.
I was going to ask, did you ever find Ruben? Because I got a couple of notes saying Ruben was in the warehouse. It's a needle in a haystack. I literally had 2 notes there, and I'm like, I couldn't figure out how to
where it was because there was this one building that had like a lock when I went up to it. I was like, I know where it is, but it won't let me open the door.
Okay, I didn't even know where it was. And like I said, in the original Pathologic one, that's the trigger for you discover him as part of the main quest, and then you get captured and sent to jail. And I was like, this is going to happen, and then that didn't happen at all. I was like, have I missed something super
Did they play
crucial?
up friendship between you, Grief, and him and Lara as much?
No, that's all I did. So Ruben doesn't. I don't think he hates it as much in the original. Grief is a much worse human being in the original, but he's still not as bad as you might think.
He's not like evil in the original.
No. I wouldn't say he's evil. It's just he's a big softy in this one. And Lara, I don't think has quite as strong, or maybe quite as obvious as the romantic interest in you as she does in this game.
Yeah, it's very obvious in this one.
So yeah, that whole thing is all new added content. That all, and I think it's good added content.
Yeah, I agree.
Well. I like how he's connecting with his old, and I really enjoyed when we were all gathered together out near the train station.
I liked that bit as well. What about Eva Young didn't jump off the cathedral in this one?
Jumps off the cathedral.
Oh, yeah, in the Bachelor's playthrough, she commits suicide for his benefit, I think.
What the fuck?
Yeah, it's brutal.
Actually, I'm getting a vague memory of that. Maybe
it's on like the 8 or something. She throws herself from the top of the cathedral.
Eva Young's the girl who's living with the Bachelor, right? Like she's the one who's given her house. Yeah, she hates you. She shows up and she tells you to go away. Yeah, it's great.
I only met her and Yulia very late into the game, so I wonder if they were even in the game.
Yeah, and that is true to the Haruspex play. So, like, don't get me wrong, all of those characters that you were so deeply invested with in the Bachelor playthrough are not really in the Haruspex playthrough.
Same with the brothers, like the Samson brothers, you can talk to them like at all as the Haruspex.
Yeah, like,
The Bachelor talks to them like every day.
Yeah, because they're so involved with the polyhedron, and that's what that whole thing is. But that's I guess that's the thing. Even when in the Haruspex playthrough, for example, I know that one of the ruling families, I can't remember if it's the Samurais or the Kings, but they're trying to set up. I think they want the younger Vlad, sorry, the Vlad's son, to take the fall for locking the cemetery, or maybe it's the other way around. Like that, because they're like, oh, the son isn't as strong as the father. So if we can get the father locked up in the cemetery to take.
It sounds like a Samurai thing, honestly.
Yeah, and I just didn't get any of that sort of stuff from this game. It just felt like they were doing it. Also, the original part of the reason that he locked them up was to protect them from the infection. And that's just not a thing. It's like they would have righted.
Yeah, I was wondering about that. I didn't see that. Well, he says that, but it was the youngest son who does it, right?
Yeah, it's the youngest son that does it, but the father takes responsibility.
I think that was the same. Although, yeah, they definitely didn't play up that humanitarian angle as much. Although, the younger Vlad seems more sinister in this game to me. He seems almost like...
Oh, dude, he's super sinister in the first game.
He's...
Like, yeah,
he seems very sociopath.
Yeah, he's definitely like that in the first game. Like, he's very, I wouldn't say he's very ruthless, but he does it in a way sociopathy is a good word for it. Like he gets you to murder people in cold blood, basically. But he's also, like he's not as held back by the. He's more progressive than his father. Like he's the one who's digging all these tunnels, which is super sacrilegious in the town of Pathologic.
Yeah, because I remember in the Bachelor's playthrough, I think it was like they suspected it was his well that was where it came from, and I think all the houses have these tiny little holes into the earth, so that the houses have a connection to the earth, and that's why that's why the districts keep getting infected, because it's coming up through the little holes.
What did you think of the reveal that it was his boy who was patient zero who deliberately got himself infected?
Makes a lot of sense to me on retrospect, honestly. Was that a thing in the first game?
I don't think it was anywhere near as clear. I remember trying to figure it out. I think it was unclear whether he was kind of like going insane or not, or whether it was something he did deliberately. But in this game, you can call him a madman and insane, and in a way he is, but it's the world of Pathologic that he would do what he would do. Like it's very believable. Like he conceived of himself as the spiritual leader of this town. He was asserting he thought it was broken, and he genuinely believed that this was what was needed to break down the town so it could be built up again. So I really liked it. I liked it as an explanation. It's a very sound one.
Well, thematically, I think the game is very cohesive in a lot of ways. Like one of the running threads about you as a Yakushan or like someone who knows the lines, as a spiritual leader, is that in order for connection to exist between things, they must be separate, and so that plays into the whole, cutting to forge connections thing that I think Isidore, that's his plan for the town, right? He's going to smash it apart so that connections can be made between the disparate elements of, the people who live there and the kin who are sort of at odds at each other's throats, and kind of tearing the town apart.
In the end, you can't save them all, which is unfortunate. But you do see, I think, in the end, we both went with, you do see a better future for the town with the children taking over. And you can see that with the connections that they're forging, like Khan and Capella, who are obviously going to marry and form the leadership team of the new town. Which is kind of
so sinister to me. I don't know if you came across that way to you, but Khan seems very naive. Like straightforward and understandable, and she was very manipulative.
I think that was the point, though, right? Like they're a good political match for one another for that reason. Like you can imagine the kind of team that would make as adults, with him being the connection to the regular person, and her doing a lot of the actual ruling and decision making. But you hope that those two would balance one another out, right? That's why it makes sense as a political alliance. I don't know, it rang true for me.
It's interesting because I do love the story of the first game, but this game was more cohesive in its themes to me, between all the stuff with the lines and the Archan and the kin, and all the metaphysical stuff with the theatre. The introduction of the traveller, who is very unsubtly death himself, right? That you make very dubious deals with throughout the game, and there's one in particular when you die too much, like he offers to take away all your pain and misery. But
that's the most obvious trap. I didn't read about that.
Yeah, and if you take it, it like locks you into the bad ending. Like not even just a bad ending, just a non-ending where you don't get an ending, and the theatre staff berate you for taking the deal, because part of the theme of the game is overcoming death through, and not death as the death of the player character, but death is this concept of nothingness that the traveller kind of represents, because he's this like force that's working against the theatre troupe almost to try and get you a non-ending, because the theatre of death, they're obsessed with like the human experience through suffering, right? And the force of death is not a physical death, but the death of the soul, really. And of human experience. And I thought all of that meshed together here brilliantly.
I reckon it's time to move on to final impressions, unless there's something else you want to add, James.
No, I think that's about it.
Right, well, I'll start if you like.
Sure.
Pathologic 2 is a fantastic game. I know I've been rating on the story a lot, but it actually is still quite a great story, and I think that Pathologic 2 is far and away the best way to experience the story, even if it's worse. And the reason for that is Pathologic 2's gameplay is fantastic. Like, it's absolutely brilliant how it takes so much opportunity cost, and you have to figure out how to balance all of these different things, and you have to do it dynamically as well. If I was to play Pathologic 2 again, if I was to start the game again, the way I would approach it strategically would be different because of the lessons I've learned. But my actual specific journey through this game would be completely different based on the variance of what gets thrown my way and based on the individual decisions I make as I go along and try and beat this game. So the fact that the gameplay is so engaging, so stressful, so interesting, and so ever changing is a masterpiece of gameplay. Unfortunately, I think that the tight, densely written, interwoven narrative that characterized Pathologic 1 with its mysterious dialogue, something that is special about we said we both preferred the obscure dialogue of Pathologic 1, but one of the things that makes it so special is that as you play through the game, all of that dialogue is suddenly not nonsense. It gains deeper meaning as you understand what the game is trying to tell you. And what you first perceived as nonsensical ramblings is actually very meaningful in most cases. There's still some silly stuff there. And that's kind of being gone because what it's been replaced with is something more intimate, the immediate suffering of all of these characters that you're engaging with. So you get a narrative which is far more in service of the gameplay, and I think it's a great narrative and a great gameplay experience, but I can't help but lament the death of what Pathologic 1 did with the story. I'm hoping that we see DLC for the Bachelor, and I'm hoping after that we see DLC for the Changeling, because it's entirely possible when that all gets released that we will have a story that's just as good as the first game when seen all together. But as it is now, it's not quite there in a story sense.
I'm worried about that. We're never getting that Changeling route. Honestly, it's only for the best. The characters are better when they're a huge question mark.
2036, Changeling DLC.
I hope.
I think that what I want to finish on is that it is hard for me to entirely divorce these two games in terms of critiquing them. But if I'm to take a step back and critique Pathologic 2 by itself, Pathologic 2 was a fantastic game. It's a masterpiece. You should absolutely play it. I absolutely recommend it. I think that when you compare these two games, if I had to tell you to choose one, it's Pathologic 2, and it's not even remotely close, because regardless of how good Pathologic 1 story is, the gameplay is so bad that it drags it down to the point where it's a very hard game to recommend. I recommend it specifically to people who fully understand the experience they're getting into and are happy to suffer through the gameplay for the story, or people who have played Pathologic 2 and kind of understand the nature of the game, who love the game world so much that they're basically on board with experiencing the gameplay Pathologic 1 to I guess, learn more about the Bachelor or Changeling rounds. Overall, it's a really good game, and I'm sorry if I've come off as overly negative about the story, because I do think I've been weighted down a bit too negatively by my love for Pathologic 1 story, but it's a great game in most aspects, and one that you should definitely play if you enjoy being stressed out of your mind.
And I would agree that is a perfect depiction of Pathologic 2, a game where you are stressed out of your mind constantly. This is not a game characterized by fun and relaxation. This is a stressful, dark, depressing experience that makes you feel like you came out on the other end, a bit, more experienced for it in some ways. I think that Pathologic 2, like the first game, does a really good this game does that better. But like Patrick, I have this soft spot in my heart for the story of the original game that I don't think any other game will probably ever fill, right? I personally think I will probably go back to the original at some point in the future to try the other routes, even though in many ways this game's gameplay completely transcends and obsoletes gameplay of the first game. What they've done with this sequel is take what was by far the worst part of the game and make it into the best part of the game. This crazy opportunity cost simulator that really pushes you to be creative when you have dozens of items that have multiple uses. There are so many different strategies that you can adopt and find with this game. It's really fantastic. In Pathologic 1, I really struggled to start my second playthrough due to the gameplay. In this game, I could easily play the same route again and have a completely improved experience because of how strong the gameplay is. So, and this is built on top of that fantastic world and story that the original was based on, and it's in some ways not as strong, in other ways much stronger, particularly with the meta narrative and background. I can very easily recommend Pathologic 2. I will be thinking about this game for months, just as I was the first game, and I will be returning to this world again in the future, and I'm super excited about the Bachelor Outage. Apparently, it's going to be completely different gameplay-wise now, which is exciting in its own ways and scary in others.
Yeah, we don't really know what's coming with that, but I'm eager to see what it is, and I'm glad that they're kind of trying something new and experimental, and it might fall flat on its face, but it's kind of more interesting than trying to do that and trying to do something unique than just be a similar thing again instead of the same one.
Yeah, so absolutely recommend this one to me. If you have not played the original, I probably would just absolutely recommend you starting with this one. It's a much friendlier player experience. The gameplay is much better. But I would not discount the value of the first game if you play this and like it. I think that there's something very special that isn't completely replicated here. But for most people, I would absolutely recommend this one. It's not going to be an easy game. I think a lot of people who play this for the first time having not experienced the original, your experience is probably going to mirror my gameplay experience more than perhaps. It's
worse, you're probably going to get hard locked.
Yeah.
Like you're going to run out of food.
I reckon you're going to have to start again from scratch. I think that it's the intended gameplay experience, honestly. This is a miserable experience about pushing through human suffering, and it is part of the experience to erase that suffering and push forward anyway. So this is a very special game. I think you should play it.
Yeah, it's a tough sell for a lot of people, and this isn't going to be the game for everyone. But it's incredible how they took like a bad gameplay experience, like an atrocious gameplay experience, and turned it into the best in slot. Like, have you ever played a game like this before? No. Yeah, it is the best at what it does, and nothing even comes out.
I've seen people refuse to say this gameplay and this file is outdated, and the game would be better without it. It just like hurts my soul to read that shit. Those people are idiots.
Yeah. So basically, those people, they see the world of Pathologic 2 and they want to experience it without having to deal with
just stuff for it.
Having to stuff for it, yeah.
Probably would enjoy the first game more.
And honestly, after a lot of backlash, they did eventually introduce some ways to tweak those survival meters. And at the end of the day, like, I'm not against that. Like, if the way you want to experience this game is modding it or using difficulties like this, that's fine. Like, people can experience these games however they like. But I do think that the best way to experience this game is to suffer and fail and then try again. And if you don't suffer and fail and try again, then you're not
getting the point of the game.
You're not getting the full base of the experience. Like, not every time you watch a movie or read a book or play a game, it needs to be happy and easy and like going. Sometimes you want the full spectrum of possible experiences. The Pathologic 2 delivers a
man, I love this series. It's great. I think I booted it up again today, like having finished it a few days ago, and was like, man, I can't get myself sucked back in because I'll just sit here for like another 8 hours.
Well, I feel like binge playing. I was just playing and playing and playing because there's always something, like there's always another thing to think about. Like you're always planning. It's a very mentally engaging game because the clock doesn't let you not be mentally engaged.
Yeah.
You cannot wander aimlessly in this game. You must have a plan at all times. And I think that was probably the key more than anything to me having more success in the video games.
Yeah. Well, honestly, I think my experience was better for like how bad it was. Yeah.
It does sound. I mean, if you're abusing the force teleport,
Yeah, that's how rough it was. Yeah.
I'm impressed. Yeah. Alright, I think that just about does it for episode 100 Pathologic 2. Massive thanks to not only those who are listening to this episode, but to everyone who's listened to us for the past 100 episodes. We've been doing this podcast for 4 years now, or nearly 4 years, and I have loved not every moment. There was some outside. I've loved most of doing this podcast, and it's been an absolute delight to do it with you all this time, James. And here's to another 100 more. I'm eager to keep going and exploring games of the past to crap on them or praise them, depending on whether they're a JRPG or not. And if you would like to hear all those wonderful moments of us praising or crapping on games in the past 100 episodes, please do go by our website, which is rspodcast.net. It's got links to every single one of our episodes, as well as a bunch of articles that James and I have written on both old games and new. Most importantly of all, it's got a link to our Discord server where you can join the conversation, recommend games, or criticize our opinions, all of which is welcome. I know that there are a lot of Pathologic fans in our Discord server, and we'd love to hear what you think. In fact, what did you dealt with yours, particularly in relation to the story, because I felt like I was seeing more praise of the story than hate for it. Although I don't hate the story, I felt like it was deserving of more critique than I generally get to see in the wider community. With that, James, it's time for episode 101. We're not slowing down, so what do you have planned for us for episode 101 of the Retrospectives podcast?
It's tough for me to pick a game that talks Pathologic 2. I kind of want a more lighthearted game, something a bit less involved gameplay, but maybe still interesting in its own way. So I've had this one kicking around on my list for quite a while. I played it when I was younger and really enjoyed it. I'm not sure if I enjoy it the same amount today, but I would give it a go anyway, and that is Fable 1, a game I played through once and loved it a bit. So have you had any experience with the series, Patrick?
I've actually played it through a couple of times. I borrowed a friend's Xbox also when I was younger. I didn't have one, but he was going on holidays for like 3 months, so I got his Xbox for 3 months, and I played Fable, and I also really liked it. Definitely killed that girlfriend of yours, though. I think her name's Whisper. That's mainly what I remember. She deserves to die. And I think when I play this time, I'm going to be evil. I suspect it's going to end up being a fairly shallow game, but maybe after playing Pathologic 2, having a bit of a shallow, relaxing game isn't the worst thing in the world to refresh us before we move on to other video games.
Yeah, I need a bit of a mental break after this one, I think.
A palate cleanser. So, yeah, it's not a bad choice by any stretch, and it will be interesting to delve into how deep the game's mechanics are. This is by Peter Molyneux before he truly went off the deep end, but I do think that it is kind of got that aspect of him dreaming bigger than was perhaps possible.
Yeah, I didn't particularly like either of the sequels when I tried to play them. There was something special to me about this first one. I hope that I can recapture that with this playthrough. But we'll see in a few weeks' time.
I still remember the Rock Paper Shotgun article, which is an interview with Peter Molyneux, and the opening line of the interview is, "Are you a pathological liar?" Like, this is how he opens the interview, and he doesn't get shut down. Like, he goes and does an interview with him. It's just the funniest shit. How aggressive he is with this interview. I love it. But yeah, anyway, thank you so much for listening to us talk about Pathologic 2 for our very special episode 100, and we'll see you